Likutei Sichos, Chelek Hava, volume 26, the first Sicha for Parsha Shemos. This Sicha will explain the great power of Moshe Rabbeinu, namely that his character, his essence, was the epitome of truth, the Milas Ha'emes. There's a quick introduction in order to be familiar with some of the concepts that we mentioned in the Sicha. So we know that when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, as it describes in this Parsha, that initially his mother, Batitzpeneu Shloishi Yerachim, she hid him for 3 months. Why? As Rashi even tells us, quoting the Chazal, because Nizbale Habayis Kula Oira, the entire home became full of light, and therefore she had to hide him in order to protect his life, because otherwise people come searching and asking what this is all about. Another thing to be familiar with, we know that Purim, why is it called Purim? The Megillah tells us, Al Shem Hapur, because of the lottery. And as the Gemara describes, that Haman Rasha threw a lottery in order to figure out the ideal time, the ideal date for when he wants to annihilate the Jews. And when it fell out in the month of Adar, he rejoiced and he said, wow, this is a bad month for them. This is a good month for me, meaning because it's bad luck for the Jews, because Moshe, their savior, died in this month. And the Gemara concludes and says, little did he know, little did he realize that Moshe Rabbeinu was also born in this month. In fact, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was born and passed away on the very same day, on the 7th of Adar. Rashi comments on this, that in fact he was born in this month. And in Rashi says, Kidai haleida shetechaper ala misa. Literally you can translate it that it means that the birth is worthy, that it should atone, should wipe away the effect of the death. We'll learn about it in the Sikha. Another thing to be familiar with, something that's mentioned in the prophet Malachi, that he says, Zichru Toiras Moshe Avdi. Remember the Torah of my servant Moshe, which of course is not the Torah of Moshe, it's the Torah of Hashem. But yet we see over there, and this is the source for it, that the Torah is attributed to Moshe. And that's why it's Toiras Moshe, it's the Torah of Moshe, even though it's the Torah of Hashem. In other words, Moshe is innately connected to Torah, that it really literally becomes as if it's his. Another thing to be familiar with, and this brings out the idea of truth, what real truth means. We know that when it comes to the Parah Aduma, the Torah says that they have to use Mayim Chayim, living waters. What does it mean, living waters? You ever see dead waters? No, the Gemara explains that what it means is that you have to take it from a source of water, from a river that doesn't dry up, meaning that it's true life. True life is measured by the fact that it's always there. It is truth. If it's alive, it's true. If it's true, it's alive. And the Gemara tells us that if you have a naharis and misyapshim, that they dry up, they cease to have a flow of water, even once in 7 years, that already means that they don't have a constant continuity, and therefore they're not considered to be, quote, true waters, and they're called Mayim HaMechazvim, literally translated, lying waters. Finally, we know that the effect of what happened by the sin of the Eitz Hadas, it says, Yorda Zuhama La'olam. That's a zuhama, look at the zuhama, some kind of filth, some kind of residue, some kind of contaminated residue came down into the world and affected all human bodies. And therefore, we have this phenomena of death. We cannot live forever. Just like a machine, that once you start using it, it starts to accumulate wear and tear, and it just cannot exist forever. It has to break down. However, what happened by Matan Torah, when we received the Torah, in fact, we actually experienced Tchias HaMesim, and there was an absolute reset, restart, and we became, as the Chazal tell us, free from the Malach HaMavis. And this is a play of words on the words where it says that it was Charus al Haluchis, and the Chazal tell us, Al Tikri Charus el Cherus, that because of the Luchis we became free from what? From the Malach HaMavis, because we were now purified, we were now cleansed, and we didn't have that filth, and therefore technically we would have lived forever. However, unfortunately, with the sin of the Eitz Hadas, that all came back. So let's get into the Sikha. So we mentioned what the words of Rashi, Kedai Haleida Shetechaper HaMisa, that the day of birth is worthy, is strong enough that it should be mechaper. Mechaper literally means to atone or to wipe away on the death. So the question is, the obvious question, what comes first? First comes the birth, and then comes the day of passing of a person, not the other way around. So if anything, it's the birth that comes and voids what happened. I'm sorry, it's the death, it's the day of death that comes about and voids what happened in the day of birth. Moreover, it says in Koheles, Shlomo HaMelech says, Toiv Yom HaMoves V'Yom Hivolde, that the day of death is much better, is greater than the day of one's birth. And as the Medrash says, and it's an obvious thing, because in the day of birth, you don't know what this person's life will actually evolve to and what it will materialize into. We don't know. Even somebody who's a tzaddik and somebody who was born with predisposed to be a tzaddik, still you can only take a tally, an account, and come to the conclusion that this person indeed lived a righteous, pious life only at the end. When the person passes away, now you can do a sum total of their life, and now you could know for sure with certainty that this person's a tzaddik. But on the day of birth, as Shlomo HaMelech says, we don't really know what's going to be. Moreover, based on what the Alter Rebbe explains, we know in Igeres HaKodesh, the Alter Rebbe explains that the day of Histalkus of a tzaddik, the day of the anniversary of the passing of a tzaddik is such a great day, because when he passes away, then later each year in the anniversary of that passing, all the accomplishments of his life, they all culminate and they all affect great wonders in the earth. So the question is, why are we saying that in regards to Moshe Rabbeinu, the day of birth is actually greater than the day of passing? Not only that, but it can atone for the day of passing. Or as we said, atone means, lechaper means to wipe away. In fact, you can ask actually a rational question, and along the same lines. You see, the Alter Rebbe explains the great power, the impact of the day of passing of a tzaddik. Perhaps the Gemara should have said, not that the day of birth atones or wipes away the effect of the day of passing. Why didn't the Gemara just say the day of passing of a tzaddik is so strong? Haman obviously wouldn't know this, but the day of passing is so powerful that Haman thinks that it's kind of game over. And we know that this is when everything really starts. Everything really kicks into high gear of spiritual effect in the world. Why couldn't this be the answer, the antidote to Haman's cruel intentions? So the Rebbe says the explanation of all this is as follows. It's true that this statement of Shlomo HaMelech, that, quote, the day of passing is greater than the day of birth, applies to each and every one, even tzaddikim, because at the end of the day, one cannot be sure what someone's life is going to materialize to, how it's going to evolve. However, there is one exception. That exception is Moshe Rabbeinu. Where do we see this exception? Because right in the beginning, as we said, we quoted Rashi, who quotes the Gemara, Nismale habayis kuloi oira. The entire home filled up with light. What does that mean? That it was clear, it was revealed and visible that the light of the Shekhinah came with his soul. It's true that every single time a neshama comes down to this world, every single time a Yiddish child is born, there is a revelation of the Shekhinah, because each and every soul is part of the Shekhinah. Each and every soul is part of Hashem. However, usually it's concealed, it's hidden. You don't see it in a visible manner. You don't feel it, it's not tangible. Only after the person affects and works through their life, through their Vaida, then you can see retroactively, or as a result of that, you can see the great light that emanates from their neshama. But that's after it's cultivated. That's after you actually have to do something to produce that light, to make it, so to speak, shine. But by Moshe Rabbeinu, it was there right in the beginning, right when he was born, and this is even before, You're still a little tiny baby. Before he even had the ability, the capacity to do any avodah, to generate that and to bring that out. In other words, it was an innate thing. It came on its own, the light shone. Now this does not in any way negate the words that Shlomo HaMelech says, that which seem to apply even to Moshe Rabbeinu, namely that the day of passing is greater than the day of birth. Because in regards to the actual accomplishments, which comes precisely through avodah, that even applies to Moshe Rabbeinu. Only after the end of Moshe's life could you now take a tally and make a sum total of all the great things he did, all the great things he effected. But this innate thing, that already from the beginning, Moshe Rabbeinu's soul shined a light and glowed and gave off this light, in this Moshe Rabbeinu stands out and is separate and totally different than everyone else, even than the greatest of tzaddikim. We'll understand this better, you have a better appreciation of this, when we look into the Pirush of the Bachai, or Rabbeinu Bachya. The Chazal, on these words, that Nismale Habayis Kuloira, what it means, what really stands behind these words, that the whole house filled up with light. So he explains that Moshe Rabbeinu, already from the point of his birth, was already suitable, and he was the potential of shining, of glowing, of giving a shine to the world, a light to the world through Torah Ur. In other words, this is the characteristic of Moshe Rabbeinu's soul. This is it, that it's conducive to give off Torah. And therefore, what do we see later in life? Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who was Masar Nafshay Aleha. He had total Mesiras Nefesh, total selflessness, and he total self-sacrifice for Torah. And also, to the extent, as we quoted in the introduction, that Nikras al Shmo, it's attributed to his name. It's as if it's his name, because Moshe was one Metzias. He was innately connected to the inyan of Torah, because Moshe Rabbeinu's connection to Torah is not the type that for everyone else, even the greatest tzaddikim, which comes as a result of one's avodah, as a result of one really endeavoring to be connected to the Torah. Rather, it was like a natural thing. It was innate. And therefore, even as a baby, before he even had the capacity to do any avodah whatsoever, already he was giving off the light of Torah. Already he was shining. Because this was the essence of his soul. That he gives off the shine, he gives off the light, he gives off this great ray of the light of the Torah. And therefore, there is no difference in this aspect of things. There's no difference in Moshe Rabbeinu when he was a baby, or was just born, just came out of the womb, or 120 years later, as he was this great giant in Torah. What does really this mean? How do we really understand? Let's understand it. The idea of it is as follows. We know that Torah is called Toras Emes, the Torah of truth. As we say it in the Bracha, V'nasan lanu Toras Emes. What is the true meaning of the word Emes, of truth? Truth is not just that it's not a lie, that is the opposite of Sheker. But rather, Emes means that it's something innately constant and everlasting without any change whatsoever. As we said, the example in the introduction, the waters, the lying waters versus true waters or living waters. Remember, it's called Mayim HaMechazvim versus Mayim Chayim, as the Torah specifies. The Torah orders that you use Mayim Chayim, living waters. What does living waters mean? That it's synonymous with truth. If it's truth, it's alive. And therefore, the fact that Moshe and the Torah were one didn't begin at some later point in his life as a result of his avodah. But rather, right in the beginning of his life, because this is who he is. Emes is not something that is prone to change. Emes is truth. Emes is all the time. And that is what it is. It's a chayim nitzchim. It's like an everlasting life. A deeper explanation of this concept of what real emes is, when we say that the Torah doesn't change, we say that the Torah remains the same all the time, and that's why it's called Toras Emes. It doesn't mean only that the Torah doesn't really descend into the world. Perhaps we can have this thought or this argument. The Torah doesn't descend into the world. In other words, it doesn't get mingled. It doesn't get sucked in to worldly matters which are inherently synonymous with sheker, right? It's olam hasheker. So that we could argue, perhaps one would think that the Torah does not get sucked into the world, and therefore it's able to maintain its integrity and remain Torah Semes. That is not true. That is not what it means when we say Torah Semes. Adarabah. The opposite is the case. The Torah goes down into the world, and it deals with all kind of worldly matters. And yet, still, the Torah remains unchanged, unfazed, and it remains in the same exact emes as it is, as it was, as it will be. The real proof that Torah is the ultimate emes is that, notwithstanding the fact that the Torah is in all places and in all times, and with places and times obviously means that there's variations, there's changes, there's different time periods, there's different eras, there's different places, there's different effects and results of the influence of circumstances, all that, yet the Torah remains one and the same. Emes, the Torah's emes. And this is actually the meaning. This can help us understand what the Chazal say, that when it says in the Torah that we received the words of Hashem, Chorus al haluchos, and that Chazal tell us, Al tikra chorus ela cherus, read the word chorus as cherus, free, that we became free from the Malach HaMavis. When the Torah was given to us, Neshamas b'gufim, not on a spiritual plane, but as we wore souls, Neshamas, in the bodies. But once we became connected to Torah, in other words, the Torah was injected into us, so that injected into us also this aspect, this attribute of emes, which what is emes? Emes is, as we said, is synonymous with and is exactly nitzchius, transcendence. It's something that stands forever, even while being in a body. And therefore, in the moment we received the Torah, when we received the emes and we became connected to emes, therefore, potentially, we would have lived forever, even while being in a body, even though the body is connected to this world. However, that changes, we said in the introduction, unfortunately, because of the cheta ego. But in essence, the fact that we have Torah means that we're connected to the idea, to the inyan of nitzchius. Why? Because Torah is Torah's emes. Emes is nitzchius. Emes is something that is transcendent. And now we can appreciate even more what it means, and what Rashi says with the words that, what it means that already from the day of his birth, Moshe Rabbeinu already started to give off light, the whole house filled with light. Because since Moshe is emes, and as we said, it means that it's not like that it means that he's not capable of lying. None of the great tzaddikim were capable of lying. We know that as a fact. They were great tzaddikim. But rather what we're saying is that he was the epitome of emes. Moshe Rabbeinu is emes. Not he has emes like all the tzaddikim have. But rather his whole being, his whole essence is emes. From beginning to end without any interruption. And therefore, we see a result, just as an example, that everything that went through the hands of Moshe, everything that Moshe made, for example, the Chazal tell us that until today's day, as we are hearing these words, Moshe Rabbeinu's Mishkan, since he is the one that made the Mishkan, he is the one that commissioned it, and it was made under his directorship, the Mishkan still exists. The walls, the artifacts, everything. Why? Because anything that went through Moshe and became connected to Moshe, since Moshe is innately emes, and emes means nitzchius, therefore they last forever. If this is the case regarding Moshe's effect and accomplishments in the world, certainly it is so with regarding Moshe himself. If things that he touched, things that he made last forever, then Moshe himself certainly is the epitome of nitzchius. And this helps us to appreciate what the Chazal tell us regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe lo meis. Moshe didn't die. What do you mean? This means that this is not just what we say, as we quoted before in the introduction, what the Alter Rebbe writes regarding all other tzaddikim. As the Alter Rebbe quotes from the Zohar, that after their passing, now that they are free from the limitations of the body, now they are ishtakach b'chula almin, now they're found and they have an effect, they have a direct power and effect over all worlds, even this physical world. Because by all the other tzaddikim, at the end of the day, there is some kind of shinu, there's some kind of change that takes place. Meaning, while they were alive, the neshama was in the body. The body obviously served as a certain type of limitation on the neshama. Now, there had to be this effect of death, which in itself has a very negative, it's a negative thing, it's a sad thing. And of course, of the people that are close to the tzaddik, it leaves definitely a sadness and there's mourning involved and so on. And only because of that are the tzaddikim able to affect the world and have this spiritual effect. That is specifically because they are no longer in the body. So what does it mean when they say by Moshe Rabbeinu is different? Only by Moshe Rabbeinu, and as we soon will see by Yaakov Avinu, do the Chazal make the statement, Moshe loy meis, Moshe didn't die. Because really what they're saying is that his effect is also in Gashmi, is Kipshutai, literally in the physical, literal, material sense. In fact, Chazal say, where do we see this? In other words, how can we connect to this idea? That the Chazal tell us that there is a Spashtusa de Moshe b'chol dora v'dora. That there is, so to speak, a continuation. There is a effect of Moshe in each and every generation. And this is in the literal sense, and where do you see it? You see it in the Nasi Hador. You see it in the leader of the generation. You see it literally that there is a literal physical representation of Moshe in a physical body. And perhaps we can say this is also the explanation where, parallel to Moshe, the Chazal say this also about Yaakov Avinu. It says, Yaakov Avinu loy meis. And immediately when the Gemara makes the statement, the Gemara retorts and says, wait, so what did the embalmers do? What did the eulogizers do? The Torah tells us they were embalming, there was eulogy, and there was a whole procession of a funeral and so on. What was that all about? And the Gemara answers, Mazarei b'chaim, afur b'chaim. That as long as you see that his children, his offspring are alive, so too is he alive. Then you can also ask, you say, well, if that's the case, what is so unique about Yaakov Avinu? Every tzaddik has that their followers still going their way. So they're also technically in that sense still alive. In other words, with what does Yaakov Avinu stand out and is separate from all other tzaddikim that when in regards to Yaakov, we make the statement that notwithstanding the fact that there was a funeral, notwithstanding the fact that there was a burial, yet Yaakov Avinu loy meis. The answer is that we're saying that Zarei b'chaim, when we say that his offspring are alive, we're not talking about only their spiritual aspect of them. We're talking about literally, physically, that if you see that they're physically alive, then it's as if Yaakov Avinu is physically alive, as if he never died. Why is that? Why do we say this only? And why do we only attribute this to Yaakov Avinu, or like we said before, to Moshe Rabbeinu? Because once again, we know that Yaakov Avinu is Midas HaEmes. We know this Chesed, this Gvura, this Tiferes. Yaakov Avinu is in the middle. The middle is the line of truth. Yaakov Avinu represents and embodies the union of Emes. And therefore, we have to say, we're compelled to say that the life of Yaakov never ended. If it ended at some point, then it's not Emes. The fact that his body was buried doesn't mean that his life ended. His life continues on and on and on and on and manifests itself into the physical, not only spiritual aspect, but into the physical bodies of all his descendants. So in short, what do we have? The life of Moshe, and parallel to that, the life of Yaakov, are nitzchim, they're everlasting, they're transcendent, even literally in this world. Not just spiritually speaking, but physically, literally in this world. Based on all this, now we can appreciate what Rashi says, Kedai haleida shetechapar lamisa. That the birth, the time of birth is worthy. It is sufficient to be mechaper on the misa. What does it mean to mechaper? To wipe away. This is the meaning. The emes of Moshe was not something that was achieved progressively throughout his life as he did more and more avodah. Rather, this is an innate thing in Moshe, that because of his neshama, This neshama emanated, shined the emes havaya, the truth of Hashem, the epitome of truth. And therefore, already in the beginning, right by his birth, you already saw that Nizmal habayis kol, he filled up the whole house with light. Even though he was still a little tiny baby who was not capable at all to do any avodah. And therefore, there's this emphasis that the Leda is mechaper. It wipes away the misa. It's true that in every tzaddik, there is a certain type of nitzchius, there's a certain type of transcendence when he passes away from the world. But still, there is some kind of, as we said before, there's some kind of inherent negative point, because there has to be death in order for that to happen. It's just that, and what does that mean? The death is something that's painful, something there's a loss of the tzaddik. You can no longer reach the tzaddik, you can no longer feel the warmth of the tzaddik, and only through that, so to speak, by the suffering of that loss, now you can achieve something greater, which is that transcendence, that nitzchias. However, by Moshe Rabbeinu, his nitzchias, his transcendence, the power of that everlasting power, is because it's innate, it's be'etzem in him. That already from the beginning of his birth, it already wiped away the effect of death, meaning that already you see it, something by other tzaddikim, you have to wait till their death to get somewhat of an appreciation of their great achievements, of their great power, of their great emanation. But by Moshe Rabbeinu, already the birth was mechaper, wipes away the regular effect of the death, because already from there, right in the beginning, by his birth, already there was this great emanation, this great power, because Moshe is the epitome of truth.